Testimony now been stricken from the record in Cal Harris's fourth murder trial. The witness, a convicted murderer, refused to answer questions about Harris's alleged jailhouse confession. Harris is accused of killing his estranged wife, Michelle, back in 2001, although her body nor a murder weapon has ever been found. In 2001, Michelle Harris filed for divorce, but the couple continued living in the same house with their 4 young children. Several months later, on the morning of September 12, 2001, Michelle Harris is reported missing by her attorney, who was contacted by one of Michelle's female friends. So let's take a look at this timeline before we get into this case. September 2005, Calvin Harris, her husband, indicted by a grand jury on 1 count of second-degree murder and his wife's disappearance. Then in June 2007, he's found guilty of second-degree murder. But just after a guilty verdict, a new witness comes forward claiming that he saw Michelle the morning after she was reported missing, arguing with another man in the Harris family driveway. Well, in July of 2009, Cal Harris granted a second trial and found guilty for the second time, but the verdict is overturned on appeal because of procedural errors. Then, in May of 2015, Harris's third trial begins, but the jury comes back deadlocked and a mistrial declared. This thing is not over yet. Harris's fourth trial is now underway. For more on this, let's bring in Wendy Patrick, a trial attorney and a prosecutor, and Dan Schorr, a former prosecutor. Wendy, I know some of the folks who watch this show have been following this case, but I still can't get my mind around it. 4 different trials for this case.
Oh, Heather, this is heartbreaking as the wheels of justice continue to turn very slowly, seeking justice for this victim. 4 trials is unusual. Normally, we like to wrap it up with 1 trial with a verdict. Here's what else is really plaguing this trial. You talked about procedural error. What happened most recently with this testimony being stricken is yet another setback. Now, it's true that the witness was a jailhouse informant, as we call them, and credibility counts, but also motive matters. And that is something that was brought up by this witness coming in and deciding, on the advice of his attorney, to take the 5th. So the judge in this case, Heather, because this is a bench trial, there's no jury, has to basically engage in selective amnesia. In other words, he has to do his best to forget, to disregard the very powerful testimony that this witness delivered.
So we've got a lot.
That's a challenging task.
We've got a lot to chew on here. Dan, let's bring you in on this. So first of all, it's a bench trial, as she mentioned, which means that the judge is totally in charge of determining everything, this person's guilt or innocence. Why do you think it went down this way?
Well, the defense gets to decide whether it's a jury trial or a non-jury trial, and the first 3 trials were jury trials. The last one was a hung jury, and the jury was pretty split. So the defense is hoping here that with 1 judge, the judge will find reasonable doubt and maybe won't be swayed by some of the emotional nature of this case and acquit the defendant. It's a calculated risk that defendants make. It may pay off, it may not. Here they heard testimony from this jailhouse informant, and then it was stricken because he wouldn't follow through with cross-examination. With a jury, that might be more of a problem because they would have already heard it, and how can you unhear something you heard? But with judges, the law presumes that they can disregard something because they understand the law.
So, Wendy, as a prosecutor, would you want to bring in this jailhouse testimony of sorts? The allegation is that the husband, Mr. Harris, had allegedly said something in jail about how he had killed his wife. But the guy who's reporting that information has a vested interest in giving out any kind of information because it could reduce his sentence.
And Heather, that's exactly the issue. But here's the problem for both prosecutors and defense attorneys. Jails and prisons are not filled with nuns and choir boys. They are filled with criminals. But in jail, often we have powerful testimony in terms of who overhears what. People bragging, people overhearing things, threats going back and forth. So we are forced, and I say we, referring to both defense attorneys and prosecutors, we're forced sometimes to call upon jailhouse informants to report what they heard. Now, the issue there, I should say, there's probably lots of issues, as Dan and I both know, but one of the issues, probably the main issue, is credibility. In other words, what is the motive for somebody wanting to volunteer what they've overheard in a jail or a prison? Many times, and there was no immunity given. There was no immunity given here.
Dan, I want to ask you about that. So the prosecution has now gone after this case yet another time, and I'm not suggesting that you just drop it because there's a woman who was potentially murdered. We should mention to our viewers that no body has ever been found. No murder weapon has been found. But you don't just give up. But on the other hand, as the prosecution, or should they at some point say, you know, we're not getting anywhere with this case?
Well, I think it depends on 2 things. One is, do they really believe that this defendant is guilty? And to keep pursuing this, they obviously do. And the second part is, do they think that they can obtain a conviction here? Twice they did obtain convictions, although they were overturned. And then there was a split jury on the hung jury. third trial. So I think it's reasonable to go for a fourth time. If they think that he's guilty of murder, they should pursue it.
Boy, Wendy, this is quite a case here. If you're the prosecution, where do you go from here?
Well, I'll tell you, where you go is you just continue plugging along with the evidence you have because you believe in the strength of your case. As Dan points out, this case wouldn't be pursued unless the prosecutors believed that they could prove it. So one of the things this judge has a big job. The judge, basically, the role is going to be to weigh the testimony that it has and disregard what they just struck.
Well, and let's underscore 4 children here. They're all, I believe, about teenagers now. They are standing by their father, but you certainly want some resolution as to what happened to your mom. She was just about 35 years old at the time she disappeared.
Right.
We have to leave it there. Wendy, Patrick, Dan Schorr, thanks as always for joining us. We'll see you again real soon.
Thank you.
Thanks.